to EMS and the Economist. As always, our economist is Shawn DuBravac, Chief Economist of IPC, speaker, author, and all-round futurist. Shawn, good to see you again. Thanks so much for your time.
Great to see you as well, Phil.
And I would say happy election day. I know you're overseas. I think that's a smart thing to do. Obviously, it's very early in the day, but the my hope is that as many people as possible get out to vote, and it all goes off as peacefully and as uncomplicated as it possibly can.
Yeah, I know when I left Washington, D.C., there were a number of stores around the White House that were boarding up their storefronts to avoid
Yeah,
the potential rioting that may occur in and around Washington, D.C.
yeah, yeah.
So we will see. This is obviously just it is the big election in the US, but just one
Mm,
of the many big elections that have taken place this year around the globe.
yeah.
And I do think if you put them together, you see a much broader narrative of how the world is thinking about the future when you see their desire to really vote in new parties
Mm,
everywhere. You see it, obviously playing out in in Europe. You see it playing out
yeah,
around the globe.
yeah,
What's kind of interesting is we have an incumbent, but we also have the challenger who is a former incumbent. So
yeah,
the
absolutely.
U.S. is a little different than other markets.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're all hoping for the straightforward, peaceful transition of power. That's the important element of it. But also to get it in the rearview mirror so we can not stop talking about it, but actually stop worrying about it. When we've got a decision, I think that's good for the economy. And what you were saying about all those elections occurring around the world, and the change of government, I think it speaks to what's been going on this year in terms of delayed investment strategies and what slowed some of those, particularly CapEx investments down. Um, but it also talks to a little bit to what we're seeing in changes in geopolitical demands as well. So, it feels that it's been a very politically charged year.
Definitely, and obviously not just in the U.S., but
No,
everywhere.
globally.
If you look at the financial reportings and the quarterly calls that have been happening from public companies across a number of sectors in advance of this election, you see the term uncertainty show up
Mm,
at a much higher frequency than it did during the last election. And what's interesting is in the last election we were kind of in the midst of the pandemic still, and so you would have anticipated that uncertainty was already high, but it remains high. So the hope is, I think, not just here in the U.S. but everywhere, that as these elections settle out, they do remove some of that uncertainty, and
mm.
businesses are able to move forward with their investment strategies and their purchasing plans. And but to your point, there's definitely a reordering happening in the geopolitical environment. This week, you've seen China meeting with leaders from other Southeast Asian countries as they look to gain a stronger foothold and be a more valued partner to many of these companies that are starting in turn to become more valuable partners and trading partners
Mm.
to other Western nations. So there is definitely a reconfiguring of the global order taking place.
Yeah, and I think that'll continue. And I think, you see that a little bit in the sentiment reports that have come through. And I was just looking through the kind of anticipated direction of the key business indicators for North America, for APAC, and for Europe. And whilst there's consistencies, not great consistencies, because the consistencies seem to be around decline in profit, and decline in backlogs, and there is some consistency around order books. The speed at which stuff is coming back seems to vary quite a bit, and I kind of feel that there's less optimism in Europe than there is in the US, but there's a general consensus that what we thought might be a Q4 improvement is pushing well into 2025 now. Is that what you're seeing and hearing when you talk to people?
Yeah, I completely agree with your sentiment that things feel a bit more optimistic outside of Europe, where
Mm,
you just have a slowing economy, you have headwinds, and I think specifically within electronics, things feel a little more challenging than they do in North America. I think you see a couple of key categories in Europe that are going to be challenging. To me, one of the top ones is EVs, where they're
mm,
competing against low-priced Chinese imports, and so that is a major competitive threat in Europe, where the EV market is arguably a bigger market than it is in
absolutely.
some of the other markets. So that I think is one of the challenges. But when you look at sentiment in the US in the electronics industry, it has really deteriorated over the last, call it, 60 to 90 days. So
Mm,
I do think that and if that continues for the next month or two, that we do close out the year on a much weaker note than where we started. Just the
mm,
general feel of industry demand is weak. In September, we really hit an all-time low. You saw that recover a little bit in October, but it's still quite low. Now there are definitely positive signs. Costs seem to be receding somewhat.
mm,
So even though we're in a still a high cost environment, you are seeing fewer firms report that costs are rising.
yeah,
Inventory availability is looking better. So there are
yeah,
some positive signs, but to me, the most concerning is this feeling that and this reporting that demand is deteriorating and demand
yeah.
is. At the same time, though, you do see, as you noted, like the optimism is still there. There's still some
Mm,
optimistic undertones looking out over the next year. And
yeah,
maybe that's the feel that some of this uncertainty, once it recedes, will switch from a headwind to a tailwind,
yeah.
and businesses will be in a better position to make decisions moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that sentiment changes around the end of the year, once we do have all these political changes out of the way. And I think that's going to be fascinating. One of the points I would mention on Europe, which I think is really interesting, is actually within Europe, there's some changes going on. And I was fascinated last week to see that Spain is the fastest growing economy in Europe. And we're used to this situation where Germany is the powerhouse, France is a very, very strong support, and everybody else is kind of being pulled along. But now you're seeing those Southern European nations really play an important role in terms of growth, not just from tourism, but also from industrial activity as well. And obviously the strength in Eastern Europe. So there's kind of changes going on internally at the same time as the global changes, which yeah, are fascinating.
Yeah, and you definitely, I mean, we hit on it already, but you certainly see that in Asia, where
Mm.
there's a clear desire to decouple from China. I think every
Mm.
company is looking at how they can do it in a measured way that doesn't draw attention to them, but that they can remove investment from China and then deploy that capital elsewhere. Early
Mm.
winners look like other parts of Southeast Asia. I think it's why you see
Mm.
China trying to create better inroads with Southeast Asia. And so, if you're looking broadly at APAC, you see headwinds in China that feel pronounced, and
Yeah,
you saw a massive amount of stimulus in the last month in China that is designed to buoy what's happening in China. But I think there's some real structural issues in China, and the other parts of APAC are actually growing quite strongly. India is another area where you continue to see strength. So I do think your point about there being a bifurcation in Europe that maybe looks a little different than it has in the past is true in other parts of the world as well.
yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to see what's happening in India and the potential to actually create a larger middle class as a result of that, more consumers of electronics. And the same, interestingly, in APAC, when you look at those countries outside of China, and it's always important to take almost to take the elephant out of the room to see what's left in the room, to understand those markets. But that's 750 to 800 million people in that area, a relatively young population, a relatively middle class population with a growing middle class. So again, it's a really interesting market as well as source for the electronics industry. And those countries like, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, they've been making electronics a long time. They know what they're doing, and they know how to gear up when demand comes back at them. So yeah, it's really interesting to see what's happening. And when you look at each of these regions, you can zoom down as much as you need to. Are we still seeing that continued differential between EMS and PCB, where PCB is really struggling to keep pace and actually get any dividend from these initiatives like the CHIPS Act?
I think the dynamic that we saw in the last month when it comes to PCB and EMS, you actually saw the book to bill for PCB increase in the last month, but a lot of that masks really weak shipments.
Mm,
So you did see a month-to-month decline in orders. And I think that, but the narrative is, oh, shipments were even worse. Shipments were down even further. So you see a little bump in the book to bill. I do think that, the narrative you just laid out, it continues to hold, that PCBs continue to have strong headwinds. Uh,
mm,
and it's become a little bit of a cost story, and so uh, you're competing against cost, and then the EMS industry continues to to see strength. Though I do think that there are still challenges there as well. I think there are some just broad general weakness that you see that you see continuing to come up. So um,
yeah. Yeah, challenging times. And that kind of brings me to the webinar I just signed up for, which is your IPC economic update and market outlook for 2025. We struggled on this call each time to kind of figure out what's going to happen in the next 30 days, and what timelines look like. And I think that's been the challenge for the industry. It's not what's going to happen, because there's a sense that there's real security in the electronics industry, and outsourced manufacturing makes sense, and all those underlying trends like the electrification of vehicles and alternative energy and the huge demand from AI for compute. They all have a positive thing, but it feels really hard to put a timeline on it. So I'm curious how you're going to do it, and I'm curious what you think about and what you have to really analyze to be able to, not just look at what's happened in the last 30 days and what might happen in the next 30 days, but what's going to happen a whole 12 months out, and what you see as those key trends as you prepare for that webinar.
the hope is by then, but by mid-month, we start to have a better feel of who will occupy the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully we have good clarity. We may not. There is some risk that we will not have
Mm.
complete clarity on that, but the hope is that we have pretty good clarity on that, despite potential challenges or other things
Yeah.
that might still be floating around by then. And that will at least allow us to paint a picture of what we think the policy environment will
Mm.
look like. And both candidates have a clear picture on how they view trading partners, especially how they view China. So I think we'll be able to outline what that means for companies that are doing business with China, what that might look like.
Mm.
You'll probably already get to feel for what some of their first moves will be, whoever ends up winning the election. And so
Mm.
we'll be able to paint a picture for that, and I think just provide a narrative and a data perspective on what are the forces at play, and what the next year might bring. There's
Yeah.
clearly a lot of uncertainties. The geopolitical risks are significant you have hot wars in two parts of the globe, and
Mm.
there's it's not clear that either of those are going to be resolved anytime soon. So those continue to put pressure on the global economy. But I think in other areas you can get a sense and a feel for what 2025 should bring.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I'm excited to kind of get the uh, get the election done so we know who's the incumbent and actually dig into some of those policies and kind of explore the direct impact of one set of policies, because much as they both want the same thing for the manufacturing industry, which is good, they've both got different ideas of how they're going to go about it,
Totally.
which I also think is fascinating. So I think it'll be great to dig in that. I hope we're going to see the Economist and the Futurist doing that combined act, because for me, when I used to visit CES, that was a really key part of it. We got those economic indicators, but you could fire everybody up with enthusiasm about some of those underlying ingredient technologies or kind of new technologies. And what I find really exciting about those in manufacturing is they affect what we make, but they also affect how we make it. And that's one of the reasons I think AI is becoming really exciting. There are a lot of players now using AI in manufacturing, and the hope is also that the demand for compute is one of the drivers in the industry. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see both. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely there are lots of drivers, as you talk about. It's not just compute, but also the need for power opens
Mm,
up whole new channels as we try to think about how do we capture that energy, how do we
mm,
produce that energy, and how do we do it in a most efficient way. And it's hard to imagine that you would build out better grids without, and expanded grids without making them much more electronic in nature,
mm,
so that the electronic component of those will be much stronger. If you think about solar, or you think about, alternatives like wind, those are
mm.
going to have, electronics in them. And so I do think that you'll not only from the compute needs, but also from, storage and power and everything else. There is a lot, and we've seen big announcements around the power component in just the last month from Microsoft and others,
Yeah.
trying to lock up the power needs they perceive that they will need over the next decade.
Yeah, that's huge, isn't it? And when you look at AI, one of the first things you think about is do we have the energy for that transition, and how do we do that? But then when you kind of peel that back and think about how the energy is used, there's actually a lot more energy used for cooling than there is for compute. So you have to wonder, should we be thinking about where we're actually putting these data centers, and should they be a lot nearer to the North Pole than they currently are? Is that an opportunity for those very sparsely populated parts of Canada or parts of Scandinavia? And I know they have been putting some data centers in Scandinavia for that reason, just because the cooling load is much lower. But it's going to be really interesting in 2025 to see how that plays out. Interesting to see how today plays out in the US. Fascinating to see your outlook in a few weeks, which will be before we speak again. We'll dig into some of that data then, and safe travels back home. And thanks so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, looking forward to our conversation coming up.